Question 1, we're given 3 countries, Yovania, Mittelstein, and Decryptia. And we're asking, and they ask us which rates these countries will probably have. Part A, high savings rates. Mittelstein would have that. Their average age is 45, and as we see from the graph above, we usually start saving or save during our prime working years, which is around age 45. High rates of borrowing, that would go to Yovania. We start borrowing early so that we can pay it off later on in life. And Yovania has an average age of 25. So, C, high rates of saving, well, you usually start that once you've retired. You start spending your savings. So Decryptia would have that as their average age is 75. Question 2 asks us, in the loanable funds market, who is usually the supply and who's usually the demander? We're given 3 choices, and what I say is none of them, because entrepreneurs demand loanable funds while savers supply those loanable funds. In the bank process, the savers supply their money to the bank. The bank takes part of that money and gives it to the entrepreneurs for their demands, and the entrepreneurs are supposed to pay back that money with plus interest to the bank. Question 3, we're given 7 scenarios where we're asked to answer either bank account, bonds, or stocks, due to whether it defines either one of those 3. Part A, which investment is typically the riskiest? The stock market. Which investment? Stocks, because stocks fluctuate very quickly, so it's pretty easy to lose your money or gain a lot of money. B, which is a corporate IOU? Bonds. When you buy a bond, you're basically saying you own. We agree to this amount of money in the future. You will pay me this. Part C, which one gives you an ownership or share in a company? Stocks, because the literal definition of a stock is a part of a certificate of ownership in a corporation. You are own part of the company by some amount. D, which one lets you withdraw part of your investment at any time? Your bank account. When you put money in your bank account, you'll be able to take money out of it whenever you want to. E, which form of investment usually spreads your money over the largest number of investment projects? Your bank account also. As we said before, when you invest your money, when savers put their money in the bank would usually take part of that money and puts it toward investment projects headed by the entrepreneurs. F, which is usually rated by private companies like Moody's or Standard & Poor's. Bonds. When they're rating it, they use the rate of return to determine whether the company is good for it or whether they're not. And for G, which one is offered by the U.S. government as well as private corporations? Well, bonds. In question 4, we're asked, if savers don't feel safe putting their money in banks or buying bonds, what's the best way to sum up what's happening in the market for loanable funds? And I say B. In the supply and demand graph, if savers don't feel safe putting their money, then the supply line falls. And due to that falling, the interest rate will have to rise in order for the banks to try and get most of their money back.
Question 5 asks about a scenario in which the government outlaws high interest rates, making the ceiling binding, and we want to figure out what happens to the total amount of money borrowed. So here, if we look at the graph, we can see that while the demand for loans increases due to the interest rate ceiling, the actual quantity of loanable funds is decreased, as the savers are less incentivized to lend. Question 6 asks what would fall the most if financial intermediation were to break down. Since financial intermediaries are the tools that people use to make financial transactions, investment is going to be the one that falls the most. And in question 7, we're looking at a bank that uses outside factors like friendship or perhaps bribery to make decisions for the company, which will inevitably lead to the bank being less successful. Those decisions aren't necessarily the most efficient for the company, which leads to things like a misallocation of resources. In a competitive environment, this is really going to hurt the bank in the long run. For Part B, we are asked how government-owned banks that operate similarly to the one referenced above are able to stay open. Really, the only way they can continue to be inefficient in a competitive market is through government bailout, which the government is incentivized to do here in this scenario for its own bank. And for question 8, we're taking up an example of a real estate agent who makes very different amounts depending on the year. To smooth her consumption, she should be consuming at most $55,000 a year based on the given data, calculated by taking the average of her yearly incomes. Next, to find out how much she should save during her good years, we just subtract the consumption per year from that income to find that she should save $35,000. And finally, to figure out how much she should be borrowing, which is really taking money out of her savings in this case, we subtract her lower income from the consumption average to get, again, $35,000.
In question 9, we're asked how a supply curve might shift in 2 different circumstances. So if Congress abolishes a law where businesses can automatically enroll people in a savings plan, then that's going to shift the supply curve left because it decreases accessibility to savings. So fewer people are going to supply savings at any given interest rate. For B, Americans decide to seize the day, then they're not going to care as much about the future, and savings will shift to the left because they're more focused on spending money in the present. Question 10. We're given the 3 big functions that banks perform and a bunch of examples. For the first one, that represents the second function because it involves spreading money over a bunch of different projects in order to minimize risk. For B, that's an example of 1 because Lorian is evaluating everyone in the family to find out which bank they should use. For 3, Popeye is a metaphor for an ATM or a checking account. For C, so it is 3. For D, George is deciding which companies are worth his investment partner's dollars. That involves evaluating business ideas, so that's 1. For E, Scooter takes different classes. He spreads his education over different areas to minimize risk, so that's 2. For F, Francis subscribes to Consumer Reports and decides which washing machine to buy. That's discrimination and evaluation among ideas, so that's 1. For question 11, we have the fact that many poor countries don't have banking systems that are able to give out large loans. So you would see more entrepreneurs coming from rich families in poor countries than in rich countries because families have to support their own business ideas. They can't take loans from the bank, so only the rich are able to self-start, unlike in wealthy countries where anyone can take their business idea as long as they have a loan. For question 12, we're given 5 major projects for a company to evaluate, and there's a break-even interest rate where if it's above that rate, the project won't be worth it, but if it's lower or equal to, then it'll be a success probably. So let's say the interest rate is 11%. In this case, according to the graph, the company will only take on projects A, D, and E. If the interest rate is all the way down at 6%, the company will only take on project D. So I drew up this demand curve on the right for loanable funds, which looks like an ordinary demand curve, but basically, as you can see, the quantity goes along at the break-even rate, and then the break-even rate increases every time it goes above that cost in millions of dollars.
So question 13 asks us to consider figure 10 in the textbook, and it asks whether a rise in government borrowing will make it harder or easier for new businesses to sell new stocks in IPOs. So for this question, we reason that a rise in government borrowing will make it harder for new business to sell stocks in IPOs because the total amount people are willing to borrow out is fixed at a given time. So basically, the supply is fixed. While a rise in government borrowing takes a larger portion of that fixed amount, so that increased government borrowing will shift the demand curve to the right, that will inevitably leave little for other spending or lending or borrowing out to be made. So we said that government bonds and corporate stocks are substitutes instead of complements because the rise in one leads to a decrease instead of an increase in the other. The lenders will choose whichever allows them to benefit the most. So an increase in government borrowing crowds out private consumption and investment, and here we see that a reduced investment is seen as a direct result from increased government borrowing. Going on to question 14, we're asked to use the Fred Economic Database and search and look at student loans over the years. In 2016, approximately $1,358.1 billion worth of student debt was owned, and that was higher than all previous years. The amount of student debt outstanding since 2006, it has been steadily increasing in a near perfect linear fashion, in fact, and we've seen that it doubles every 2 years. For question 16, we said that U.S. is acting like a young country because we're borrowing a lot, and hence it's like young adults taking student loans to go to college. We're borrowing to invest in the future. So we're suffering a deficit right now because that enables us to spread out the risks and costs. Right now, we're not primarily desaving or spending our accumulated wealth. We're also not saving a bunch, so we're also not a middle-aged country.